నమస్కారం. నా ఈ ప్రయత్నం మీకు నచ్చినట్లయితే గనక మన ఛానల్ని సబ్స్క్రైబ్ చేసుకొని పై జాబితాలోని మరిన్ని వీడియోలను చూడటం ద్వారా మీ నైపుణ్యాలను, జ్ఞానాన్ని కూడా అభివృద్ధి చేసుకోవడానికి ప్రయత్నించండి. జై హింద్. Please like, share and subscribe for more videos. Thank you.
When white plays e4, one of black's most fighting responses is c5, turning the game into the sharp Sicilian defense. If white is not interested in learning an incredible amount of opening theory in the mainline open Sicilian, then an anti-Sicilian strategy is another possibility. A popular anti-Sicilian employed by amateur players, which is also occasionally seen at Grandmaster level, is the c3 Sicilian, also known as the Alapin variation. We reach this opening after the moves e4, taking space in the center and preparing rapid development. White is ready to play d4, so black fights against this plan with c5, fighting for control of the d4 square and creating an immediate imbalance in the pawn structure. White can prepare d4 with knight f3, preparing to enter the open Sicilian after d4 on the next move. Another way to prepare d4 is by playing c3 on the second move. We have now entered the c3 Sicilian, or Alapin variation. This modest pawn move is not without venom. White's main idea is to play d4 without having to give up a center pawn for black's flank or non-central c5 pawn. The point is, if black plays c takes d4, then white can recapture the pawn with c takes d4, maintaining a healthy two-pawn center. The main drawback to the c3 Sicilian is it does not develop a piece, and it also prevents the knight on b1 from moving to its most active and natural square, c3. It's important for black to play actively and not allow white to build a comfortable center. The main lines for black to consider include d5 and knight f6, both immediately attacking white's pawn on e4. Let's first take a look at the direct d5, immediately grabbing space and attacking white's pawn on e4. White should not allow black to maintain this healthy center, so after e takes d5, queen takes d5. It is true black has moved the queen out early, but white is unable to exploit this fact with the natural knight c3. Since this is not an option, white should strike in the center immediately with d4. Black's main response is knight f6, but it's important for us to understand what happens if black immediately plays c takes d4, when white should recapture with c takes d4. Capturing on d4 is a double-edged decision. White now has an isolated queen's pawn, which can be a serious target for black's pieces, especially if more pieces are traded off and the game approaches an endgame. On the other hand, by capturing on d4 so early, white is able to play knight c3, attacking black's queen and preparing active piece play, which is exactly why white enters these lines in the first place. Let's see what happens when black intensifies the pressure against the isolated pawn with knight c6. White develops a knight and supports the isolated pawn with knight f3. Instead of trying to directly undermine white's center, black can patiently play e6, reinforcing control over the square in front of white's isolated pawn, d5, as well as preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop with a reasonable position. If black tries to actively destroy white's center and win the d4 pawn with bishop g4, pinning the f3 knight and indirectly adding more pressure against the d4 pawn, white can strike back using the open c3 square with knight c3, gaining a tempo against the queen. If black plays bishop takes f3, attacking white's queen, then white can play knight takes d5, preparing to deliver a fork on c7. If black decides to retreat the queen to the natural-looking square, queen d7, which reinforces the light-squared bishop, as well as preserving the option of rook d8, adding more pressure against the isolated pawn. This actually turns out to be a terrible mistake, as black's queen is now aligned with its king on the same diagonal, allowing the powerful shot d5. As we can see, this isolated pawn is not just a weakness that has to be protected, it can be used as an attacking resource. White is threatening to simply capture the knight, so black is actually losing a piece, because if the knight tries to escape with knight e5, adding more pressure against the pinned knight on f3, white can play bishop b5, pinning the queen to black's king. To avoid the disaster after queen d7, Black may try to keep the queen active with queen a5, pinning the c3 knight to white's king. Once again, white's isolated pawn proves its worth with d5. If black tries to counterattack with rook d8, pinning the d5 pawn to the queen, white can calmly respond with bishop d2, unpinning the knight as well as the d5 pawn, when white enjoys an excellent position. Instead, if black plays knight e5, by trying to undermine white's d-pawn so quickly, black has neglected kingside development, allowing white to play the powerful bishop b5 check. White's active pieces come to life, exposing black's vulnerable king. The premature attack has backfired, as black needs to block the check with one of the already developed pieces when white enjoys an excellent position. Another attempt to undermine white's center is with the immediate counterstrike, e5, intensifying the pressure against d4. White should avoid playing d takes e5, as this allows queen takes d1 check. King takes d1. White has lost the right to castle, and the extra pawn on e5 is short-lived after bishop g4, threatening knight takes e5. And if white tries to prevent this plan with bishop b5, pinning the knight to the king, black can solve this problem by castling the king, delivering check and unpinning the knight, so e5 is about to fall. Instead of capturing the e5 pawn, when black plays an early c takes d4, white should always consider the active resource, knight c3, developing a piece and threatening black's queen. Black can try to add more pressure to white's position with bishop b4, pinning the knight to the king. White can simply unpin the knight with bishop d2, once again threatening knight takes d5. So after bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, white now has the bishop pair and is happy to allow exchanges with e takes d4 and knight takes d4, because as the position continues to open, white's bishop pair increases in strength. If black decides to lunge forward with e4, white has the active response knight e5, centralizing the knight to an active post and threatening bishop c4. So if black simplifies the position with knight takes e5, d takes e5, white invites black to trade queens, increasing white's lead in development with rook takes d1. White's bishop pair can prove quite dangerous as the position continues to open, so the c3 Sicilian isn't an opening black can simply overwhelm by trying to immediately exploit white's isolated d-pawn. Instead of playing c takes d4, a more solid approach for black is to initiate kingside development with the centralizing knight f6. White can respond in kind with the natural knight f3, centralizing the knight and supporting the center. Once again, black can decide to play e6, stabilizing the center and focusing on kingside development at the expense of blocking black's light-squared bishop. Since white is currently not able to play knight c3, black can decide to play more actively with bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3 as well as activating the bishop before playing e6. White should unpin the knight and continue to develop with bishop e2. If black captures the knight, then white's bishop will enjoy the long diagonal, gaining a tempo against black's queen. A natural continuation for black is to play e6, reinforcing the center and preparing to complete kingside development. White can decide to castle immediately, or else challenge black's bishop with h3, inviting black to surrender the bishop pair and activate white's bishop with bishop takes f3. An invitation black should decline with bishop h5, maintaining the tension against white's knight. After white castles, black can add more pressure against white's center with the natural developing move knight c6. White should now reinforce the center with bishop e3. White is threatening d takes c5, so now is a good time for black to make the exchange c takes d4, c takes d4. White is now ready to play knight c3, but unlike the previous example, black has done a better job completing kingside development before playing c takes d4. A solid continuation for black is bishop e7, developing the bishop, preparing castling, as well as keeping the d-file clear so that after knight c3, black's queen can remain centralized with queen d6. This is a typical position in the Alapin Sicilian when black plays d5 on the second move. White enjoys comfortable development and may consider moves such as queen b3, adding pressure against black's pawn on b7, in preparing to complete development with rook f to d1, as well as rook a to c1. Black is ready to castle the king to safety and also centralize the rooks, adding more pressure against the isolated d4 pawn. Both sides should enjoy reasonable chances in the ensuing middle game struggle. Instead of the direct d5, the other popular main line is knight f6, attacking white's center and taking advantage of white's inability to play knight c3, protecting the e4 pawn. White should respond by taking space and challenging black's knight with e5, when black centralizes the knight with knight d5. The knight on d5 is somewhat loosely placed, but the point is if white attacks this knight with c4, this abandons the plan of d4, and it also seriously weakens the d4 square. The other idea behind black's strategy is to provoke white's pawn to e5 to counterattack it with d6. White is not without resources as well, and continues with the plan of central expansion with d4. White has a solid pawn chain from b2 to e5, so black can break up this chain with c takes d4. White can play c takes d4, but since the d4 pawn is currently pinned to the knight, white can remain flexible with knight f3, adding protection to e5 and increasing the pressure against d4. A natural response for black is knight c6, intensifying the pressure against white's center. White can once again play c takes d4, which leads to a safe, relatively balanced position. If white wants to play more aggressively, then an interesting option to consider is bishop c4, continuing to develop and adding pressure against black's unprotected knight. By playing bishop c4, white is actually prepared to gambit to pawn, because after knight b6, white's bishop is now under attack, so after bishop b3, securing the bishop on an active diagonal, black can now accept the gambit with d takes c3. When after knight takes c3, white enjoys a lead in development, while the e5 pawn restricts black's development. White is ready to castle on the next move. Meanwhile, black's king remains stuck in the center, so white certainly has compensation for the pawn. Instead of accepting the gambit, black can fight for the center by moving the d-pawn to d6, or immediately occupying the center with d5. In either case, white will capture the pawn with e takes d6, opening up the e-file for white's major pieces to later enjoy. After black plays queen takes d6, white can continue to offer a pawn by castling the king. If black accepts the pawn with d takes c3, white will exchange queens with queen takes d6, e takes d6, and then recapture the pawn with knight takes c3. Once again, white argues that a lead in development, combined with a weak d6 pawn, an exposed enemy king, compensates for the sacrificed pawn. This appears to be a sensible claim, especially as black typically avoids this option. Instead of accepting the gambit, black still needs to be accurate, as the careless move bishop g4, pinning the knight backfires as white's active light-squared bishop can play the disruptive bishop takes f7 check. So after king takes f7, white has the discovered attack, knight g5 check, attacking the enemy king and discovering the queen's attack against black's bishop, when black's position is simply falling apart. After looking at the alternatives, black's most reliable choice is to play the solid bishop e6, developing a piece and offering an exchange of light-squared bishops. White can decide to play it safe with bishop takes e6, followed by regaining material with knight takes d4. But if white feels adventurous, then white can play the dynamic knight a3, threatening knight b5. After d takes c3, capturing a second pawn and offering a trade of queens, white can avoid simplifications with queen e2. If black plays c takes b2, this allows white to gain a serious initiative after bishop takes b2, activating the bishop on the long diagonal and preparing to centralize the rooks to exploit black's underdeveloped forces. Instead of capturing the pawn, black can play bishop takes b3, when white increases the complications with knight b5, forcing black's queen to retreat and escape the danger in the center with queen b8. White captures the bishop and opens the a-file with a takes b3. White has achieved the goal of creating complicated, dynamic play. Although white has a serious lead in development, black remains solid and should continue to focus on development with moves such as e6 or g6, challenging white to prove sufficient compensation for the sacrificed material in the lively struggle that will follow. If black doesn't challenge white's setup with the main lines d5 or knight f6 on the second move, then white should continue to focus on expanding in the center with d4, knowing that white should have a solid position. If black plays a move such as e6, it's worth noting that after d4 and d5, white can decide to play e takes d5, but another choice is to take space with e5. When the opening is transposed into the advanced variation of the French defense, an opening which is normally reached after black plays e6 on the first move. For the interested viewer, you can keep in mind that the c3 Sicilian can also be played after knight f3. It looks like white is going to play the open Sicilian with d4 on the next move, but you can actually still decide to play c3 instead. One point is that if black plays the popular d6, then you can now play c3 without allowing black to strike in the center with d5, as this loses critical time. But by not playing c3 on the second move, black also has other reasonable options to consider. Another point is if you like to play another anti-Sicilian, such as the Rossolimo or Moscow variations, which is responding to black's second moves d6 or knight c6 with bishop b5. If black plays e6 or g6 on the second move, then bishop b5 is no longer an option, so you can then consider playing c3 followed by d4. The c3 or Alapin Sicilian is a solid, reliable option against the Sicilian. If you aren't worried about fighting for an objective opening advantage and you prefer to avoid massive amounts of